I'm Bailey Cho,
And I'm Griffin Fry.
and this is Philosophically Speaking. If you can't tell, we need a new intro.
Yeah, that's pretty mediocre. Bailey made it on his own without my approval.
I'm gonna put the blame on Jackson, but he's giving us the middle finger, so
Alright, well
that's ridiculous.
If you have any suggestions for an opening, let us know.
Yeah, definitely.
Alright, let's kick it off.
Talk
to me, Bailey.
Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this. This is going to be the first episode, hopefully, of many, although with the current situation going on, I'm not really sure where that will lead us, but we'll figure it out. I feel like that's what you have to say today at this point. But yeah, so this is a podcast that we've been wanting to make for a little bit, and we're really excited that we can do it now. It's called Philosophically Speaking because we're going to be talking about some of the ideas from the past, from some famous philosophers and texts that we read, in the context of today. Yeah. I think that right now we're at a point in the world where we interact with a lot of media, but don't necessarily contextualize it with historical precedent. And I think that's important to step back and do that sometimes a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I think we find ourselves doing this for fun, like a lot of times, just with our friends at St. Anne. So I figured why not just kind of bring it into a different light where we have microphones and we are all fancy.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not that fancy.
No, really not. He woke me up trying to get here this morning. He could have been outside for like an hour, but somehow I woke up. Yeah. Anyways, so putting that all aside, let's get on to the topic of today's episode. This is episode 1, and we're going to be talking about culture and globalization, and specifically through the lens of Friedrich Nietzsche. So, past week we've been reading a little bit from this book, Untimely Meditations, and specifically on the first essay where he responds to another philosopher of the time, David Strauss, and this is all in the context of a post-war Germany, but not one of the wars that you would think. It's the Franco-Prussian War. And essentially the context for this is David Strauss writes an essay claiming that the war was a victory for German culture. And Nietzsche responds in this essay by saying that it's actually not a victory for German culture. It is in fact could be a defeat if they don't handle it correctly.
What does he mean, victory for German culture? Like, what's a victory for culture?
That's a big point for Nietzsche's argument here, is that throwing around these words like victory is pretty. It's a pretty loose term, because what Nietzsche says is that victory for culture is a really weird thing to talk about. He says that when it comes to a geographical military war, the only way that you could really see it as any sort of victory would be not for culture in general, but for the culture of the winning side would be if that culture was spread to the people which they beat in the war. There's some things about that are a little...
There's definitely lines we want to draw with Nietzsche.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely have to think about it in a broader context here. But he really talks about this kind of idea that talking about culture in this victory, moments of triumph among the educated Germans who are supposed to push culture forward and kind of improve the arts in Germany. Specifically, he's saying that there is no original culture yet in Germany. And he says that a lot of the quote-unquote classics in Germany are not even from German authors or musicians.
So what... Original culture is such a weird idea, I feel like.
Yeah, I felt that too when I first came across that.
What is origin like? When do you think it develops? I don't know.
Yeah. So Nietzsche says it develops when there has kind of been this, as people form a new country or society, right? They bring in elements from before wherever they were, right? You understand that a little
Sure.
bit. So he says that in Germany at the time of the war, those elements had not yet evolved into an original German identity, and that a lot of those elements were borrowed from, say, the French and other European countries around them, and the idea of a German culture and unique identity was not fully developed. So for him, Germany does not have an original culture yet. So you see where he's going with that.
Does he mean Germany as in the country that was formed in the late 1800s? Like, okay.
Right. The for him, his area that he was talking about was this modern German culture, this modern Germany,
Okay, yeah.
in a new era of Western powers in Europe that were becoming more and more prevalent, like Russia and the French and UK and Germany, as these bigger powers rising up. I think that what he noticed was that through all these military victories, Germany was one of these only countries that still didn't draw on cultural significance before it. Um, so that's kind of, let's not get too carried away here with all of that. That's kind of the background that we see Nietzsche spread out. And I think that there's a lot of dissecting you have to do with just that to figure out what you agree with, what you think has changed in our society today that you can't really view it in the same way.
You're
And I think something interesting that has affected our society very recently is technology and social media specifically. So, on today's episode, I want to talk about this idea of culture, the spread of culture, and the lines we have to draw at certain points because of that.
okay. I want to start off by talking about what how culture can need preservation because so Nietzsche's attacking this idea that this idea of like a global culture and culture all becoming just one monotonous thing, just a culture of the world that's like just the strongest and most wealthy and most prominent voices becomes the culture of the whole globe, right? Is that what he's against?
Yeah, that's actually good that you brought that up. One of the most important kind of, he says there are definitions that he makes at the beginning of this essay is on the definition of culture and how blind some people are to that definition. And he views culture as one end of a spectrum on the spectrum of culture and barbarism. Essentially, he sees culture as being this kind of perfect middle ground where you have one unique style that he defines as culture. And he says barbarism is almost anything else, where you have either no influences on your style, so you're totally bare, you don't have any inspiration from historical precedent or anything like that. Your style is absolutely nothingness with no significance whatsoever. The other end of that is that there are way too many different styles being brought in. And I'd say that he would say that's where Germany was, because they weren't original culture. They weren't one unique culture. They were the combination of tons of different cultures from around Europe, from people in modern Germany who had picked up those traditions from neighboring countries and so on, and brought them to Germany, yet Germany did not have their own culture at that time that was comprised of its own historical significant past.
I feel like Nietzsche's writing this in what I don't know.
It's turn of the, I want to say, it's like mid 19th century.
Okay. I feel as though culture has kind of gotten a more vague definition now. You know what I mean? Like, it seems like we kind of define culture in so many different ways, like the culture of your school, the culture of your city, the culture of your country, whatever, religion, whatever it is. And I don't know, having such a specific definition of what a culture is, and it's just this country culture, and that's that collection of people as a. I don't know. It's interesting to kind of see it through that view, but my initial reaction to that is it must be more complicated than that, than just a country being so separated by borders. Because countries are created by many different people from many different countries coming together. So having a definition of German culture and other cultures, and those cultures, I've said culture a fuckload right now, but
I feel like that's the episode today.
yeah. But those cultures interacting with each other, it's hard to see the barriers. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, definitely. I feel like that is 100% a problem with a lot of how Nietzsche talked about it, is that, I mean, for example, let's talk about Russia. Russia, this country where you have borders with, all the way out to Asia, and then you come back to civilized Russia at the time, right? And you have borders to Eastern Europe. I mean, to your point, the idea that someone could derive a unique singular culture from that seems almost impossible. But I think that something that Nietzsche would argue here is that having one unique culture is not necessarily a unique, singular idea that everyone shares. It's more that the ideas that people share in their communities are unique to those people and specifically within the country, in Russia. And I think a good example of this is if you talk about nationalism in Russia, and specifically that of musical nationalism, at the turn, around the same time that Nietzsche was writing this, actually, there was a composer, Mikhail Glinka, who went abroad because there was no Russian composers at the time in Russia. Everyone went abroad for foreign education in music if they wanted it. Glinka went abroad to Italy and very quickly realized that there were elements from Russia that he needed to incorporate into his music. And so he left his education, went back to Russia, self-taught himself, and became the first big Russian nationalist composer. And that started a trend of 100 years of composers who would be extremely nationalistic in their music, and they would follow a specific set of rules, things from including what they called the Oriental element, which is obviously from a side of Russia that is nowhere near where Moscow is. I feel like they would include folk legends in their inspirations. These are all things that are very different from one another, but they combine to create this identity for Russia.
So Nietzsche would say that that was a example of culture being
Original.
preserved in a good way.
Yeah, I would say so.
But this also, I want to bring this up. I think this idea of preserving culture, that's hard for me to kind of get a grasp on, because Nietzsche says that we are kind of moving, the cultures individually are moving towards one whole thing, but isn't that just kind of the natural course of culture? Like, isn't it just doing what it will inevitably do and finding its way through what's going to happen, and we shouldn't have any say in that?
Right. So I think this is a really important point here, is that, in my opinion, that perspective comes from a modern perspective where we are exposed to cultures through technology at a faster rate than anybody in a 19th century Germany would be exposed to other cultures. I also think that because of that, Nietzsche's philosophy around this is quite different than it would be if he was here today. And
Right.
so this idea that cultures are all kind of like coming together and that we're being influenced from one another, and because of that we're creating this one kind of global identity. We are obviously still so far from that with all of the kind of stereotypes that people throw out still, and just all the problems we have with being able to accept someone from around the world. But think about how much harder that would be for someone from Nietzsche's era, who, on average, would never even leave the country, never even leave the town to see, the next town. Like, those are the type of things that are, they don't have to think about the incorporating of other cultures. And that's why when he talks about a war, and the only way for a war to mean victory for a culture, for that culture to have been spread to other people, is because there's no other way to share your culture with anyone else.
In that time, right?
Exactly. And so I want to turn to modern context, because it's so interesting that with Nietzsche we have this idea of war being the war spreading culture, and now we have social media and technology spreading culture. And what are the implications of that? Because, like you said, you're talking about this in a global identity sense. Nietzsche would never even think about that.
Right.
You're saying that we should just let it run its natural course. Nietzsche would say that that is a complacency that is problematic for the progression of a culture. And I think that where we have to kind of connect the dots here is where this culture, our culture around the world, is spreading while we're being complacent, because we don't even think about it, but us posting on social media and following other pages and just being online, we're exposed to so much more different cultures, and we're learning about different cultures at a rate that is faster than anybody in the 19th century was learning about other cultures.
Just interacting with random ass people who we don't know at all.
Yeah.
And they become part of part of what we intake, which is really weird. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think is the best kind of way in which culture can, because right now it does seem like culture will probably move towards being globalized. I think either that or kind of be even more torn apart. But if culture does become inevitably more globalized, what is like a mechanism which we can use to kind of both preserve culture and have cultures interact in a healthy and productive way?
I think that's a really interesting point that is a really hot topic today. I think
Cultural appropriation,
right,
stuff like that.
The three main ideas, there are obviously more in betweens, and these are not just the three that happen, but we have cultural appropriation, cultural learning, and assimilation. Right? Those are a lot of the words that you hear thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm trying to think about how Nietzsche would think about those terms in a modern technological world, because it is so interesting that culture is in such a weird flux right now compared to where it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, what we're talking about, it's so much easier to fall into one of these three categories than it was. And I think what we have to talk about is that two of those words that are thrown around are part of a systemic problem with not technology. They're not new problems. It's a power dynamic problem with the predominantly white group of people who are able, because they're in a position where they're not going to be uh, uh, ridiculed for it, they're able to appropriate another culture. Whereas for someone in a minority culture, and especially today with this globalization you're talking about, it's a lot harder to represent that culture and be accepted, which is what creates this assimilation towards this kind of blanket statement global culture. And I think that's what it is that globalization and global culture is very much not global culture. Because when we say global culture, we talk about the culture that is most predominantly uh, uh, in media, right? We're talking about people and cultures who are able to use technology, but also money and wealth and status to share their culture at a rate that is much more intakeable than someone from a kind of local, more third world country in their culture.
Right. So you're saying that because of social media, you can monopolize.
This is a philosophy podcast. This is not a. This is not a.
Just you guys know the word.
Yeah.
You can have a monopoly on.
There we go.
Culture. Is that what I mean? That's such a weird idea that like. Just because of it, like, that used to only extend to food and like ruling over a small group of people, but now because of everything being so interconnected and there's so many resources, you can just have complete control over culture entirely.
Yeah, I think the problem is that there are not really people who are specifically aware of that.
Right.
I mean, I'm not ridiculing anyone for posting on Instagram about like their trip to Japan or something like that. Like, that's cool.
You shouldn't go to Japan right now.
Well, not right now.
Yeah, steer clear.
I was supposed to go to Japan in the summer.
I was supposed to go to Italy.
Yeah. There are bigger problems, but
yeah.
Still. But like posting about traveling or something, it's fine. But the idea is that there is this underlying issue with the countries that people visit and the countries that have the most they're out there more than other countries in terms of what people see. Exposure, that's the word I was looking for. We found it. Countries with the most exposure, the cultures with the most exposure, are the cultures that are almost marketing themselves.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that there is a historical significance to preserving unique identity of not just the quote-unquote best cultures. Because I don't think that you can say there's quote-unquote best culture. Each culture is significant to the people who are there and taking part in that culture. And by saying that, that culture is not significant, that's a very big problem. That's putting that's a large group of people who are being thrown away from something that they can call almost a home in some senses.
Do you really think that we're seeing the effects of this yet? You know what I mean? Because I'm thinking about this, like, this sounds like colonialism a lot, right? Just coming to another culture, essentially destroying it and making it irrelevant. But now the problem is that it's so much more underlying, and it can just go without being noticed. Because we're not killing people and infecting them, we're just quietly silencing them through the means of more wealth and more technology.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the bigger problems with what's going on is that this is not talked about. It's not loud, people aren't necessarily like you said, we're not bringing blankets with viruses over, right? I mean, but if you think about it, if the goal of some of those attacks on people were to kind of get rid of their identity and culture, get them out of the pictures that you can come in and replace them almost, is that not what social media is doing?
Right. It's just a replacement of cultures with other ones. Um, do you think there's a way that social media can actually be used to amplify that, or is it inevitable that the wealthier people who have more social media will kind of monopolize it?
Yeah, I think that question is different depending on if you ask it theoretically from before, without precedent of what's going on social media, or
Right.
now. Um,
Social media isn't inherently bad, but it's being used in a bad way right now.
but again, without the awareness that that's a bad way,
Right.
which is just another problem. And that's the problem with so much that's going on in today's world, is that there are so many underlying issues going on that have been pushed under the rug or just not talked about because we've kind of accepted them as just natural facts of what's going on in the world right now. Um, we say that because a group of people is just like not as accessible as another group, that's why we're not seeing it as often. But at the same time, we're seeing them as little as we did, a few hundred years ago, but we're seeing other cultures at a rate that's so much higher now. And it's creating this kind of accelerated trend that Nietzsche was talking about, in the fact that, cultures were being exposed through war, but now the powers that were able to fight those wars and successfully expand their identity to other people were large, wealthy states that could afford to do that, and wouldn't lose. We're just seeing that at a much more accelerated and unnoticeable growth rate right now.
Um, Essentially, globalization presents a big threat to culture, and also, as we will talk about in the next episode, sort of epidemics and disease, because everything is so interconnected, everything can get spread so easily. And as we can see, it's very easy for those things to cover up with what China's government did. But that's for next episode.
Yeah, I I think this was really good.
This was good. I had a great time. I hope you did.
Yeah,
You're
so
one of our 2 live streamers.
yeah, exactly. No, but if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, we appreciate you a lot. Look out for episodes 2 every other week. And for now, we'll catch you later. This is Philosophically Speaking. I am Bailey Cho,
And I am Griffin Fry.
and so long.
welcome back to our live stream, to our live streamers. Welcome to episode 2 for those who are listening in. This episode, this is Philosophically Speaking. I'm Griffin Fry.
I'm Bailey Cho.
Yeah. Okay, I forgot about the intro song. That terrible.
It's really bad.
It's still bad. We're gonna have it better next time, I promise.
Please help.
All right. Today we're talking about plagues.
Yeah.
And
why are we talking about plagues?
I don't know. It just kind of popped into my head.
Just popped into our heads.
Just a random thought. There's plague. This book that we're talking about.
Right.
Why don't you introduce us to it?
Sure. So for episode 2, we're talking about a book titled The Plague.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that works with our episode.
Yeah. So this book was authored and written by Albert Camus.
Albert Camus.
Yeah, he was
That's how you say it. And
I don't speak French.
I do. So.
Okay. So if there are any problems, blame Griffin today. Anyways, so this the book was published by Camus in the mid 1940s, and it's actually based on around the same time period. It was based on a plague that went through a French Algerian city in Iran. However, while it's based in the same time period, it's also based on a late 1800s plague of the cholera epidemic that went through the same city. So the book touches on a lot of things, such as the authorities' response to an outbreak, the people's response to an outbreak, and has a lot of important ideas that are very similar and parallel today. Kind of almost scarily so.
Yeah. The parallels are shocking from what I understand. I have not read it. Bailey has, so I'm kind of going to be asking questions from our listeners' view, and Bailey's going to be informing us a little more. And then we're going to bring it to a more broad discussion of plagues and how this book applies to us today.
Yeah, and I would like to say that we'd like to thank viewers like you and listeners like you, because this form of media has had such an impact already that this book, The Plague, has hit the bestsellers list. It was published in the 1940s. So thank you guys. We know that it was all you, and you are the reason why this book is doing so well now.
Yeah. New York Times bestseller just today.
Yep.
I don't want to say that we single-handedly did that.
But we single-handedly did that.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure. So moving on past that, this book feels like it was written today. I'll bring it back. Like I said, it's set in the French Algerian city of Oran, and it talks about this outbreak, which starts relatively slowly, but noticeably. There are, in the city, a few people who die from an unknown illness. It's not good. And in the streets, random rats just turn up dead, which is not really a good sign.
You never want that.
You never want that.
Dead rats.
No.
I mean, you don't want
the live.
You don't want alive rats either, but
the dead ones are.
Dead rats in the middle of the street is
not a great
sign.
So people start to realize, okay, there's this unknown illness going around town. And precedent says that unknown illnesses going around town and causing people to turn up dead aren't a great thing. They're, not necessarily, people don't really want that. Slowly but surely, this outbreak starts. And it goes from slowly to fast. all of a sudden lots of people are starting to get infected. And remember, this is based on the late 1800s outbreak in the same city of Iran, at a time when mitigation of such epidemics are not necessarily authorities' strong suit. The book then touches on the authorities' response, or, well, the lack of response specifically. The authorities very slow, extremely slow, to even recognize that there is an epidemic in the city. And we'll get into later kind of what we think the reason is for that. But going on, there's this outbreak in the city. The authorities don't really recognize it. It finally gets so bad that the authorities have to recognize it, and then they put such a strict hand on how to combat it. Strict hand.
I almost this sounds weirdly familiar. I feel like I've heard something about something like this.
I think this probably is just confirmation bias, Griffin.
Can't put my finger on it.
No, I don't think you can.
But so you say that they were really strict after they refused to acknowledge it for a long time.
Right. Yeah, you could say that they didn't want people to worry about it until they realized that it was fucking going to kill everyone. In other news, China's lockdown of Wuhan has been pretty effective. That was totally unrelated, by the way.
Yeah, smooth transition.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, we're talking about the parallel to China's response and the natural tendency of governments in their response to outbreaks like this. I think it's interesting. We're going to talk about more of human nature in response to these outbreaks than the book itself, but I think it was interesting to bring up how similar this book is to what's going on right now. I just felt like that further strengthens the idea of every point we're going to talk about today, because it is a consistent response that we have seen, the response that China has responded with. And another thing I will say is what we have going on in this world right now is a power dynamic in which, in the city of Iran and in Wuhan, the people, the large group of people in the city who make up a bunch of lives that do not control this outbreak or necessarily how they protect their own lives, versus the small handful of authority figures and what their goals are for the city.
Right.
So, I know you haven't read the book.
It's true.
But just based on that information, what are your initial thoughts on how similar these reactions are and kind of what we can derive from all of that?
I mean, it's like a question of whether government is inevitably going to be a negative force in this, and whether human reactions lead to government, which lead to a poor reaction, or is there a way in which government can kind of function well and find a way to combat the disease effectively? Because, I mean, obviously China's response was bad because they covered it up. They tried to just silence the doctors who said anything. And first of all, we shouldn't be taking China as
The soul.
that every government, obviously, but
Yeah.
we've seen it in our own government too, with
Italy.
our president
In Italy.
and in Italy, right? I mean, and our president also shouldn't be a hallmark of our democracy, but he was elected. That's what the facts are,
And he's making the decisions.
yeah, and he said there's no need to worry. We have 15 cases. It'll be 0 soon, but that's obviously not the case. I don't know the exact numbers right now, but a lot of people have died. A lot of people are infected, and it seems like the natural course that governments take to respond to outbreaks is just to immediately calm people down to protect their own administration. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think we have to go to the why. Because there is some natural tendency that governments have and people in government have to do that. Because this isn't just a modern issue. We were talking before the show. It is so interesting that as technology evolves and as the world grows and society grows to a newer, modern society, our ability to combat these outbreaks, I mean, medication-wise, of course, we have the technology to help mitigate the damage that some of these illnesses can cause. However, the response itself, stepping away from a medical perspective, the government response has not changed. And we've seen that because of this 200-year gap between Iran and Wuhan. 200 years, and the response is too similar.
Yeah.
Too similar to say it's not true. And I mean, these outbreaks have been going on for not just centuries, for thousands of years, sweeping through societies. And I mean, there's an obvious natural tendency amongst government officials to respond in this way. And so, on today's episode, I really want to step back and question the why, and then delve deeper into how authority and people elected into authority, how their minds have to work for that to have happened.
I feel as though this outbreak, it seems like while it's gonna suck, it's not gonna be the end of civilization. But that doesn't mean that we're not trending in a direction that could lead to an apocalypse. You know what I mean? Because every time that this happened, every time that some crisis happens, it kind of seems like we just address it using the obviously flawed system we already have and don't actually fix the problems that are presenting. And if we're not prepared next time some crisis happens, who knows what's going to happen.
Right. I think that it's important to take a look at that kind of idea of preparedness. And essentially, what humans have to change about themselves and the nature that we have to become more prepared. Because I don't think it's a question of just simple steps we take next time. Because this is a fundamental flaw in authoritative nature. Just stepping into a look of America for a second, I would say that because of our two-party system, we naturally elect people who are more authoritarian than they are libertarian.
Right. The people who will be seeking power, essentially. This is the theory that I didn't make this up, but the people who trend to seeking positions of power are people who really mostly want the power. Obviously, there are good politicians. Just off the top of my head, Andrew Yang.
Just throwing that
Random.
out there.
I don't have any bias. But most people who are in power are only there because they enjoy the power and they enjoy the attention. Tell me if this sounds like anyone, perhaps our president.
Maybe.
I want to bring up something that was brought to my attention by my astronomy teacher, who I'm a big fan of. So I assume most people have heard of Fermi's paradox. For those who haven't, it's essentially the question is, based on how much life happens on Earth, we should have found life by now, or some intelligent species should have advanced to the point where we can hear them or contact them. But we haven't. So the question is, why? Why haven't we found an intelligent super civilization that can communicate with us? And I think the most worrying answer to that, and this is not the only answer, but one of the answers is there is something integral to life, and therefore later on civilization and intelligent species, that makes those species at a certain point in their evolution crumble.
Almost like a code, like a blocker.
Exactly. It's like there's something in the code of the universe that forces those civilizations to break apart at a certain point when they reach to bigness. We've seen it in a smaller scale with every civilization on Earth, except the ones that are currently existing, like the Roman Empire, stuff like that. When things get too big, they break apart. And on a galactic scale, there could be just something that kind of makes, when civilizations advance so much and interconnect so much with one globe, there could be something that just makes those stop, be it plagues, be it those nations destroying each other, who knows what it is. But the suggestion is the reason we haven't found other intelligent life is because we are approaching the destruction of our society, because there's just something that will cause us to destroy ourselves.
I mean, I don't want to get too far into this, but we're going to do an episode on it, simulation theory.
Yes.
Of course.
Sorry.
No, but I think that it's an important point to what we're talking about today.
Yes.
And if any of our listeners have suggestions at all for books or topics, we will have a form or a way in which you can suggest those things shortly, whether it be in person if you see us, or on our Instagram, which is at Philosophically Speaking Podcast on Instagram. If you have any suggestions, DM us or find us in person. We'll love to have that. But looping back to this idea of this kind of like code that's written in to our universe that, stops us from getting to certain places. If we're putting that in the context of like a rational idea of how the world works, we can say that code comes down to human nature, right? We say that human nature is this or that, and it just seems like code, right? Like these are things that we do, and these are things that we don't do. And with governments, the fact that this response has been the same for so long, while everything else around us has changed, is almost a proof of this constant in our world.
Right.
And it's hard to wrap our minds around.
I think the question is it because obviously if we're humans and we can think about this stuff, it seems to me that there's a chance that we can develop to a point where we create a society that only stimulates human ingenuity and creation and does not stimulate the bad things we do. And if we can think about all of this, how can it not be applicable if we all work together as a productive government and society? It's confusing. I don't really know.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like backing into our world and what's going on right now, you can say that response differs from country to country, from China to Italy to the United States to Japan to Korea. But when it comes down to it, I mean, the same natural system is set up where a government's in place to try and stop this general panic. And then the people themselves are the ones affected by what's going on, not the rules. The rules aren't affected. The people are. And the rules that these governments are trying to put in place are, it almost seems, I mean, we all think that China and, communist regimes want their outward appearance to look good, that they'll risk their own people for it. But I think that that's a oblivious statement to make when you look around and every government does the same. Because in America right now, we have a president who is like, we have 15 cases, it's going to be none soon. In Italy, I don't know about you, but I really did not hear about how bad it was until it got really bad. And if you've paid any attention to what's going on, not in China, because, again, Communist Party controlling what goes out, but in Italy, we have doctors who are relaying the horrific images through their warnings to everyone else, not the government. And what's going on around the world feels the exact same. It's this idea that the governments are wrapped up in trying to mitigate panic rather than mitigate the spread of illness.
I feel as though the question comes down to, and this isn't a question I can answer, it's not a question really anyone can answer, except the next 50 years, I think. Because the question is, will we begin to function well, or will the way that everything is functioning now win out, and then we will meet our inevitable demise? And I just don't know the answer to that. Right now, to me, it seems like the doomsday side is winning.
Well, I think that our reaction says that so far.
Right.
Like we're not reacting in a way that helps us.
No.
And
Well, our governments aren't.
Our governments aren't, and I think it shows how much our governments control what happens within our cities and states. Mm-hmm. I mean, as much as we can self-impose rules on ourselves, the people who are allowed to walk around us will walk.
Right.
And I mean, I'm all for like the freedom of movement, of course. And I don't think that China's lockdown policy is correct. And it's because they had to lock down because they didn't catch it at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And we're at a day and age where I feel like it's unexcusable to not catch these at the beginning.
Right. I also think it's interesting how humans tend towards tribalism, and we are always stuck to these communities that we build for ourselves because that's how we've always survived, and that's how we always probably will survive. It's just a question of striking the balance between being an individual and having a government of individuals who create a a better society. Because when society gets too big, it becomes something we just can't handle. I think that's made clear.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this draws back to there are things that progress and better in the world, and there are things that are constant. And this is not a type of episode where we're going to answer a question. I don't think any episode will be the episode where we answer a specific question. But I think that we can open a question. And that question is, why are these human tendencies so integral to what's going on around the world and the precedent that they've set? I mean, it feels like the fact that we can talk about it means that we should be able to do something about it. And while they aren't natural tendencies, just because they're natural tendencies doesn't mean that we can try and mitigate the amount to which they affect our lives and disrupt everything else about us that's natural. I don't think it's natural tendency for someone in power to shut down everyone's natural state of being able to walk around and be a regular human being. If you are in power and have the ability for 30 days to make sure that no one can leave their house, you're essentially taking away everyone's natural state for 30 days that they've continually grown up with, and they've been told that that is their human right to be able to do that. And as someone in authority, taking that away feels so unnatural that it's not even a question of if it can be done.
Right.
And I don't think that that is the answer right away on any of these questions. I think that it's actually probably when you get to a bad point, like China did, is what they do. But there's an in-between of free movement in that, in which governments are not readily searching for. And it's because any steps towards trying to stop something like a pandemic around the world feels unnatural. And the question is, so many things are hard for us to accomplish, yet we strive to do it. So why is something like this, that is seemingly hard to accomplish as an internal dialogue, why is this so hard, so much harder to the point that we can't even do it? Why is it so hard for governments to respond in a correct manner, which is appropriately addressing the fear and saying, this is what's happened before. This will happen if we don't do anything. We're not going to say, don't worry.
Yeah.
We're going to say, these things are happening now. These things are happening now because this is an issue and it's not natural. This pandemic is not something that naturally is happening every day of our lives. So we have to take unnatural steps to fight it.
I think we hope to kind of begin to maybe propose a solution to some of these problems in our next episode. It'll be about government and Andrew Yang's book. For now, I think that's about it. We've covered most of our bases.
Yeah. I'm really happy that we started this up.
Me too.
And thank you to all of our listeners. It's really awesome. And we hope that we can be somewhat entertaining, enlightening, or just tortas.
Tortas.
But either way, thanks for coming out. And this is Philosophically Speaking. I am Bailey Cho.
And I'm Griffin Fry.
And we'll see you sometime in the future.